In a village hidden beneath the thick emerald canopies of the great African forests, where the air smells of rain and the earth is alive with the hum of cicadas, Kalichi lived a life full of purpose. She was the village healer, and her hands, scarred from years of tending to plants, mixing potions and guiding souls, were known for their magic. But it wasn't the magic of grand spells or ancient incantations that made her respected. It was her deep understanding of people, her ability to listen, to feel and to heal, not just the body but also the heart. Kelechi had spent years learning the arts of healing from the elders, who spoke in soft, knowing voices about the spirits that inhabited the earth. Yet despite her skill and knowledge, there was something she could not control, her own heart. And that heart had long been given to one person, Kamsi. Kamsi was her best friend, the one person who could make Kalichi laugh when the world seemed too heavy. They had grown up together, and their bond had only deepened with time. Where Kalichi was quiet, observant, and careful with her words, Kamsi was bold, full of life, and often too trusting for her own good. It was a quality that made her the village's most beloved storyteller, and more recently, the object of attention for one man in particular, Chabusa. At first it was all so simple. Kamsi had met Chabusa at a festival. He was a traveler, a stranger to the village, but there was something about him that was undeniable. His smile, his eyes, his voice. He spoke with such confidence, with such charm, that he seemed to have everyone wrapped around his finger. Kamsi, with her open heart, was no exception. And though Kelechi, as always, kept her observations to herself, she could not help but notice how quickly Kamsi became enchanted by him. "He's different, Kamsi. I don't know what it is about him, but there's something off," Kelechi had said once as they sat under the shade of a baobab tree, watching the sun dip behind the horizon. Kamsi had laughed, her eyes sparkling with the kind of joy that only comes when one is truly in love. "You're just worried about me," she teased, poking Kelechi's shoulder. "But there's nothing to worry about. He's perfect. You'll see." Kelechi smiled, but her heart tightened. There was something she couldn't shake, something in Chabusa's eyes, something in the way he looked at Kamsi as if she were a prize to be won, not a person to be loved. It unsettled her, but she said nothing more. Kamsi was happy, and that was all that mattered to her. Days passed, and the bond between Kamsi and Chabusa grew. They spent time together, walking through the village's lush fields, talking about their dreams, their pasts, and their futures. To everyone, they were the perfect couple. Chabusa, with his broad shoulders and handsome face, was everything Kamsi had ever wanted. But Kelechi could see past the charm. She watched how he always seemed to have the right words to say, the perfect timing to make Kamsi laugh or swoon, and the way he subtly guided her decisions. And it wasn't just Kelechi who noticed. The elders had spoken quietly amongst themselves, their voices filled with concern whenever Chabusa came around. "There is power in the way he speaks," one elder had whispered, "but power does not always come with good intentions." Still, Kelechi did not voice these thoughts to Kamsi. She couldn't. What if she was just being paranoid? What if her fears were simply the product of her own deep care for her friend, her desire to protect her from any harm? But then one evening, as the sun set and the villagers gathered around the fire for a night of songs and stories, Kamsi came to Kelechi with eyes full of excitement. "I'm getting married, Kelechi," she said, her voice barely containing the joy. "In 2 days. I've never been so sure of anything in my life." Kelechi's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing. 2 days? It had only been a matter of weeks since Kamsi had first met Chabusa. The speed with which everything had progressed was dizzying. Kelechi tried to mask her shock with a smile, but inside, a cold weight settled in her chest. "That's fast," Kelechi said, carefully choosing her words. "Are you sure?" Kamsi nodded eagerly, her hands clasped in front of her, a soft, dreamy smile on her lips. "I've never been more certain of anything. I feel like I've known him forever. It just feels right." Kelechi felt a knot form in her throat. How could she explain her fears now? How could she say, "He's not who you think he is," when Kamsi was so far gone in her own emotions? Instead, Kelechi simply nodded, offering her friend the support she so desperately wanted to give. She could. only hope that somehow everything would work out. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. Something about Chibusa didn't sit right with her, and it gnawed at her insides, like a warning she couldn't ignore. That night, as she lay awake in her small hut, the sounds of the village celebration drifting in through the open window, Kelechi's mind raced. There was so much she wanted to say, so much she needed to do, but for now, all she could do was watch, helpless, as her friend marched toward a future she didn't understand. And in the back of her mind, one thought echoed over and over. What if it's too late? Days passed, and the excitement around Kamsi's impending wedding grew. The village was abuzz with preparations. Women in brightly colored fabrics sewed intricate patterns into Kamsi's wedding gown. The elders gathered to bless the couple, and the men prepared the feast that would celebrate the union. But while everyone else was wrapped up in the joy of the occasion, Kelechi could barely sleep. The smile on Kamsi's face, the sparkle in her eyes whenever Chibusa was near, only seemed to deepen the pit in Kelechi's stomach. It wasn't just that she didn't trust Chibusa, it was something far more unsettling. Kelechi tried to go about her usual routines, tending to the sick, making herbal remedies, and guiding the younger children who came to her for advice. But every time Kamsi came to visit, or when she saw Chibusa standing beside her, the same feeling washed over her. It was as though there was a shadow creeping into Kamsi's soul, one that wasn't there before. The light in her eyes seemed to flicker, a faint but undeniable change. It was as if Kamsi wasn't entirely herself anymore. The bond between them was undeniable. Kamsi had always been so open and carefree, full of life and laughter. But now, when Kelechi spoke to her, it was as though a veil hung between them. The words that once flowed easily between them now felt strained. "Are you sure about this, Kamsi?" Kelechi asked one evening, as they sat under the wide, sprawling branches of an ancient tree. The air was thick with the scent of flowers in bloom, the rustling of leaves overhead, acting like a gentle lullaby. Kamsi had just finished describing the wedding plans, her voice filled with excitement, but Kelechi couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Kamsi looked at her, her face glowing with happiness. "Kelechi, what are you talking about? This is the happiest I've ever been. Chibusa is everything I've ever dreamed of. I know it sounds fast, but when you know, you just know." Kelechi forced a smile, but inside her heart was pounding. "I understand, but you've only known him for a short time. I've seen how quickly he moves, how he takes control of things. You should be careful, Kamsi." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy, and for a moment Kelechi saw a flicker of doubt in her friend's eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a look of determination. "You worry too much, Kelechi. I've never felt so certain of anything. Chibusa is kind, loving, and he knows what I need. He understands me in a way no one else ever has." Kelechi swallowed hard, feeling a sense of helplessness wash over her. What more could she say? How could she explain that she didn't just worry for Kamsi's happiness, but for her very life? How could she make her see the truth without sounding like a jealous friend, trying to tear her away from the man she loved? The conversation ended there, with Kamsi waving away Kelechi's concerns as if they were mere whispers in the wind. But that night, Kelechi couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled into her bones. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her gut, deep in her chest. And as much as Kamsi tried to convince her that everything was perfect, Kelechi knew better. The days leading up to the wedding were filled with small, unsettling moments. Kelechi would often catch Chibusa staring at Kamsi in a way that made her skin crawl. It wasn't a look of love, it was possessive, calculating, as if Kamsi were a prize he was determined to win at any cost. Kelechi had watched enough to recognize that kind of gaze. She had seen it before in men who didn't care about the person they were with, only about what they could take. It wasn't just the way Chibusa looked at Kamsi, it was the way he spoke to her too. Every time Kamsi shared a thought or a dream, Chibusa would echo her words, but just slightly, as if he were guiding her, not just supporting her. It was subtle, but it felt manipulative. Kelechi had seen this before, when people didn't just love but tried to shape others to fit their own desires. She'd seen it in some of the villagers who had come to her for help, seeking to undo the damage caused by toxic relationships. One evening, when Chabusa was with Kamsi, and Kalichi was passing by their hut, she overheard their conversation. It wasn't much, just the gentle murmur of their voices, but the tone of Chabusa's words sent a chill down her spine. "You've always known Kamsi," he said, his voice smooth, almost coaxing. "But now, everything will change. You'll see how much better your life can be when you finally let go of the past and embrace the future I can give you." Kamsi's response was light, almost absent, as though she had already accepted what Chabusa said as truth. "I trust you, Chabusa. You've always known what's best for me." Kalichi's breath hitched. The words stung like a slap across her face. How could she not see it? How could Kamsi, the same woman who had always been so strong and independent, let herself be shaped so easily by this man? Kalichi felt a pang of guilt. She had always prided herself on being a good friend, someone who would protect Kamsi, someone who would keep her safe. But now, it felt as though the very thing she feared most was happening right before her eyes. It was as if Kamsi had been swallowed whole by Chabusa's charm, unable to see the danger that lay beneath his carefully constructed facade. The feeling of helplessness grew stronger, gnawing at Kalichi's insides. The weight of the impending wedding, the imminent danger, was pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. She had to act. But how? How could she make Kamsi see the truth before it was too late? Late into the night, when the village was quiet, and the only sound was the distant howling of the wind, Kalichi sat by her window, staring at the stars. She didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing. She couldn't let her friend walk into the arms of a man who would break her. She had to find a way, no matter what it took. Tomorrow she would speak to Islander, the wise elder who had always helped her when she was lost. Perhaps together they could find a way to save Kamsi from the dark path she was about to walk. But for now, all Kalichi could do was wait and pray that time wouldn't run out. Kalichi couldn't sleep that night. Her mind raced, her heart thudded in her chest like a drum, and the shadows in her room felt like they were creeping closer with every passing second. The village was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hum of nocturnal creatures. But inside her there was no peace. Every whisper of the wind reminded her of how powerless she felt to protect Kamsi, how desperately she needed answers. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the horizon, casting a soft golden glow over the earth, Kalichi had already made up her mind. She had to see Islander, the old, wise healer who had been a constant presence in her life since she was a child. His quiet strength and vast knowledge of the mystical arts had helped many in the village, and Kalichi knew that if anyone could help her make sense of this strange situation, it was him. Islander lived on the outskirts of the village, in a small humble hut, nestled among ancient trees. His home was always filled with the scent of herbs and incense, and the walls were lined with shelves of strange forgotten books that seemed to hold the secrets of the earth itself. Kalichi had always found comfort in the steady rhythm of his life, the way he never rushed, always taking his time with each task as if he knew that the world would wait for him. Today, however, she felt no comfort. She was filled with a sense of urgency that gnawed at her, pushing her forward. When Kalichi reached Islander's hut, she found him sitting on his porch, his back straight, his eyes closed in meditation. He seemed to be in his usual state of calm, unaffected by the turmoil in her heart. The sight of him, so serene, almost made her hesitate, but she didn't have time for hesitation. "Islander!" she called out, her voice a little sharper than she intended. His eyes opened slowly, and he gave her a small, knowing smile. "Kalichi, my child," he said in his deep, soothing voice. "You are troubled. Come, sit. Tell me what weighs on your heart." Kalichi sat beside him, her legs trembling as she struggled to find the right words. She had never felt more conflicted. Part of her wanted to pour out everything. Her fears for Kamsi, the growing sense of danger she felt around Chabusa, and the gnawing suspicion that something dark and dangerous was unfolding. But another part of her was terrified that she might sound crazy. How could she explain her fear without seeming like a jealous friend, meddling in something that was none of her business? Islander, however, seemed to read her thoughts. His gaze was gentle yet piercing, as though he could see straight into the depths of her soul. "Speak freely, Kalichi," he said softly. "The truth is never easy to carry, but it is always better than silence." Taking a deep breath, Kelechi told him everything about Chibusa's sudden appearance in the village, his charm, and the way he seemed to wrap Kamsi around his finger. She described the way Kamsi had changed since meeting him, the distant look in her eyes, and the sense of unease that had begun to build between them. She told him about the unsettling conversations she had overheard, about the way Chibusa had a way of guiding Kamsi's thoughts, as if he were the one making all the decisions in their relationship. "I don't know what it is, Islander," she finished, her voice quivering. "But I feel like something is terribly wrong. It's like Chibusa isn't just in love with Kamsi. He wants something from her. And I think it's something dangerous." Islander was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming lightly against the armrest of his chair. Kelechi's heart raced as she waited for him to speak. Finally, he exhaled softly and turned to face her fully. "Kelechi," he began, his voice low but steady, "what you have described is not love. What you are seeing is manipulation. Chibusa is not here to simply marry Kamsi. He has a much darker purpose." Kelechi's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Islander's eyes narrowed slightly, as if searching for the right way to explain what he had seen. "There are powers in this world that many do not understand. Some men, some beings, are not satisfied with the love of another. They seek something much deeper, something that goes beyond the heart." Kelechi leaned in, her entire body taut with anticipation. "What is it? What does he want?" Islander paused, his gaze shifting to the horizon as though he were weighing his next words carefully. "Chibusa is after Kamsi's heart, but not in the way you might think. He does not seek her love or her affection. He is after something far more powerful, a piece of her very essence, something that connects her to the spirits of this land." Kelechi felt a cold chill run down her spine. "You mean he wants to take something from her?" "Yes," Islander said, his voice grim. "He is a man of dark magic, and he knows that Kamsi is not just an ordinary woman. There is power in her blood, something ancient, something that has been passed down through the generations of her family. It is said that her lineage is tied to the spirits who protect this land, and Chibusa, he wants to claim that power for himself." Kelechi's mind was reeling. She had always known that there was something special about Kamsi, something that set her apart from the others, but she had never imagined it was something so profound, so dangerous. "How do we stop him? How do I save Kamsi?" Islander's eyes softened with sympathy, but there was no hint of hesitation in his words. "The only way to stop Chibusa is to reveal his true nature before he can complete his plan. But this will not be easy. He is a master of deception. And the moment Kamsi is bound to him in marriage, the ritual will be set in motion. You must act quickly, Kelechi." A wave of dread washed over Kelechi. She had known deep down that time was running out, but hearing it from Islander's lips made the urgency feel even more real. The wedding was only 2 days away. "But how do we expose him?" Kelechi asked, her voice shaking. Islander's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "There is a way. I can help you, but it will require great courage and a willingness to face the truth, no matter how painful it may be. You must make Kamsi see Chibusa for who he truly is, before it's too late." Kelechi nodded, determination flooding her veins. She had no choice but to fight. She couldn't let her best friend fall into Chibusa's clutches, no matter what it took. As she left Islander's hut, the weight of the task ahead of her settled heavily on her shoulders. She had a plan, but the road to saving Kamsi would not be easy. Still, Kelechi knew one thing for sure. She would not let her friend walk down a path of darkness without a fight. Kelechi could hardly breathe as she walked back through the dense forest toward her village. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, swirling faster than the wind in the trees above her. Every step seemed to echo louder than the last, and the realization of what she had learned from Islander gripped her like an iron chain. Chibusa wasn't just a man who wanted to marry her best friend. He was a predator, a master of dark magic, and his intentions were far worse than she could have ever imagined. The only thing that kept her feet moving was the burning sense of urgency that had taken hold of her. She didn't have much time. The wedding was only 2 days away. 2 days. And in those 2 days, Kamsi's life, her very essence, could be snatched away by Chabuzer. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on Kelechi's chest, making it hard to breathe. When she reached the village, she didn't stop. She walked straight to Kamsi's house, her mind already whirling with plans. If she was going to save Kamsi, she had to do it quickly, and she had to do it carefully. The last thing she wanted was to make Kamsi feel like she was meddling, but time was running out. Kamsi's house was small but cozy, tucked into a corner of the village where the sun always seemed to shine a little brighter. It was the home Kamsi had grown up in, the one her mother had lived in before her. As Kelechi knocked on the door, she felt a pang of sadness. She had known this place all her life, and now it felt like a cage, Kamsi's prison, and soon, possibly, her tomb. The door creaked open, and there stood Kamsi, her smile as radiant as ever. But to Kelechi it looked forced, like a mask. She saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes before the smile returned, the familiar gleam that once brought Kelechi comfort, now unsettling her more than anything else. "Kelechi, you're up early," Kamsi said, her voice warm but distant. "Is everything okay?" Kelechi nodded quickly, forcing a smile despite the knot in her stomach. "Yes, I just needed to talk to you. I've been thinking a lot lately." "About what?" Kamsi asked, stepping aside to let her in. There was something about the way she asked that made Kelechi's heart ache. Kamsi didn't seem herself, like she was already slipping away, piece by piece, into Chabuzer's world. They sat down at the small wooden table in the center of the room, the same table where they had shared so many meals and laughter. Kelechi could almost hear the echo of their past conversations, those carefree days before everything had changed. She could feel the weight of those memories pressing on her now. "I need to ask you something important, Kamsi," Kelechi began, trying to steady her voice. "Have you noticed anything strange about Chabuzer?" Kamsi looked at her, surprised. "Strange? What do you mean?" Kelechi hesitated, trying to choose her words carefully. She didn't want to make Kamsi defensive, but she knew that if she didn't speak up now, she might never get another chance. "I mean, do you ever feel like he's not being honest with you? Like maybe he's hiding something?" Kamsi's brow furrowed, and for a moment, Kelechi thought she had lost her. "Kelechi, what's going on? Are you suggesting that Chabuzer is hiding something from me?" No, it's just that—" Kelechi trailed off, searching for a way to make her friend understand, without sounding crazy. "It's just that he's not who he seems, Kamsi. I've been watching him and there's something off about him. Something dark." Kamsi looked away, and for a brief second, Kelechi thought she saw the tiniest flicker of doubt in her eyes. But it was gone before she could say anything more. "Kelechi, you don't know him like I do. He's been nothing but kind to me. He loves me. I can feel it. He's not like the others." Kelechi's heart sank. She had hoped Kamsi would see the truth, but it seemed like her friend was too far gone, too wrapped up in Chabuzer's spell. But Kelechi couldn't give up. Not yet. "I know you think that, but love doesn't make someone control you, Kamsi. Love doesn't make someone want to take away what makes you who you are." "That's not love, that's manipulation." Kamsi's face reddened and she stood up abruptly. "I don't want to hear this, Kelechi. I love him, and I'm marrying him in 2 days. I've made up my mind." The words hit Kelechi like a slap. Her stomach churned as Kamsi turned away, crossing her arms over her chest. Kelechi could see that she wasn't going to break through. Not now. But there had to be another way. Then, like a spark of light in the darkness, an idea came. To Kelechi, she had been so focused on trying to convince Kamsi of Chabuzer's true nature. But maybe that wasn't the right approach. Maybe the key was to show Kamsi the truth, not tell her. Islander had said that the only way to stop Chabuzer was to reveal his true nature before it was too late. Kelechi knew what she had to do. "I can't just stand by and watch you make a mistake, Kamsi," Kelechi said, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "You're my best friend, and I won't let you walk into this blindly. If you want to marry him, that's your choice, but I'm going to show you something you need to see." Kamsi looked at her confused. "What are you talking about?" Kelechi stood up and walked toward the small chest that sat against the wall. She pulled out the small carved box that Islander had given her earlier. The healer had told her that the box contained a magic, powerful enough to reveal the true nature of anyone who was hiding their true self. She didn't know if it would work, but she had to try. "I'm going to use this," Kelechi said, holding up the box. "And you're going to see Chabuza for who he really is." Kamsi opened her mouth to protest, but Kelechi cut her off. "Trust me, Kamsi. Just give me a moment. You have to see the truth, or you'll never be free." The room was silent for a moment, and Kelechi could see the hesitation in Kamsi's eyes. For a brief moment she thought Kamsi might actually say yes, but then the defensiveness returned, and Kamsi shook her head. "You don't understand, Kelechi. You can't just change my mind like this." But Kelechi wasn't backing down. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to give up now. "I'm doing this for you," she said firmly. "And you'll see. After today, you'll understand." "Why?" As Kelechi prepared the box, the sense of urgency pulsed through her. There was no turning back now. She had to show Kamsi the truth. And if that meant breaking through the walls that had grown between them, so be it. The clock was ticking, and every moment counted. Kelechi's hands trembled as she held the small, intricately carved box in front of her. The wood felt warm against her skin, almost as if it were alive, its surface pulsing with a quiet energy. It was a simple thing, no larger than the palm of her hand, but she knew what it could do. Islander had explained that it was no ordinary trinket. It held the power to reveal the true essence of anyone who hid behind a mask. The truth could no longer be hidden. Kamsi was standing by the window now, her back turned toward Kelechi, arms folded tightly across her chest. She seemed to be lost in thought, still wrestling with the conversation they had just had. Kelechi knew her friend wasn't angry. No, Kamsi wasn't angry. She was scared. She didn't want to see what Kelechi was trying to show her. But Kelechi couldn't give up. Not now, not when everything was at stake. "I know this is hard, Kamsi," Kelechi said softly, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. "But you have to trust me. You have to see what he really is." Kamsi didn't respond right away. For a long moment, there was nothing but the soft rustling of leaves outside the window, the faint breeze brushing through the trees. The world felt impossibly quiet, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Finally, Kamsi spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I want to believe you, Kelechi. I really do. But it's hard. I'm in love with him. And he's always been so kind to me. He's everything I've ever wanted." Kelechi felt her heart sink, but she didn't back down. "I know you love him, Kamsi. I can see it. But love isn't supposed to hurt you. Love isn't supposed to make you feel like you're losing yourself. And Chabuza, he's not the man you think he is, not even close." Kamsi turned around, her face pale but determined. "What are you saying, Kelechi? Are you telling me you think he's lying to me, that he doesn't love me?" Kelechi's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to meet Kamsi's gaze. "What I'm saying is that he's using you, Kamsi. He's been manipulating you from the start. And if you go through with this wedding, he'll take everything from you, everything you are. He'll destroy you." For a long time, Kamsi just stood there, her lips trembling as she processed Kelechi's words. Kelechi could see the war inside her friend's eyes, the desire to believe, the yearning to hold on to what she thought she had. It was painful, almost unbearable watching Kamsi struggle like this. But Kelechi knew this was the only way. The truth had to come out, whether Kamsi was ready for it or not. Kamsi took a shaky breath, her voice faltering as she spoke. "You're telling me he's not human, aren't you? That's what you're saying, right?" Kelechi nodded, her heart racing. "Yes, Kamsi, he's not human, and he's not who you think he is. But I can show you. I can show you what he really is. All you have to do is trust me, just this once." There was a long pause, and Kelechi could see the flicker of doubt in Kamsi's eyes. It was as if Kamsi was standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to jump or turn back. She was afraid, and who could blame her? The truth was terrifying. If Chabuza was what Kelechi said he was, Then everything Kamsi had ever believed. Kin was a lie. "I don't know if I can do this, Kelechi," Kamsi said, her voice barely audible. "What if I'm wrong? What if I lose him forever?" "You won't lose him, Kamsi," Kelechi said gently. "You'll be saving yourself. And maybe, in the end, that's what matters most." Kamsi was silent for a long moment, and just when Kelechi thought she might give in, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, show me." Kelechi felt a sense of relief wash over her, though it was tinged with a deep sadness. She wasn't sure if Kamsi was truly ready for what she was about to see, but there was no turning back now. With shaking hands, Kelechi opened the box. The moment she did, the air in the room seemed to shift. It was as if a hidden current of energy had been released, and the very fabric of reality seemed to bend around them. The box itself didn't glow, didn't spark, nothing so obvious. But Kelechi could feel it, the power thrumming in the air. She could feel the magic working its way through her veins, connecting her to the world in a way she had never experienced before. This was the power to see the truth, and it was unstoppable. Kelechi stepped back, holding her breath as she looked at Kamsi. "Look at him. Look at Chibuza. He's not the man you think he is." With a mixture of fear and curiosity, Kamsi turned toward the door, where the faintest sound of footsteps could be heard approaching. The moment the door opened, Chibuza stepped into the room. His presence filled the space, as it always did, tall, dark, and impossibly handsome. But this time something was different. His smile, that perfect smile that had once charmed Kamsi so easily, faltered for just a second. It was subtle, but it didn't escape Kelechi's watchful eyes. Kamsi smiled at him, her expression soft and full of warmth, but Kelechi could see the hesitation in her eyes. She had seen the truth, the doubts Kamsi had been holding back for so long, the fear that had been building in her heart. Chibuza stepped forward, his gaze landing on Kelechi first, then shifting to Kamsi. The moment their eyes met, Kelechi felt it, the darkness swirling just beneath his surface. She could almost see it, like a shadow wrapping around him, pulling at the edges of his human form. It was barely visible, but it was there, something inhuman, something cold and ancient, lurking just beneath his skin. Kamsi looked at him, her smile faltering, and for the first time, she saw it too. She saw the flicker of something sinister in his eyes, a glimmer of the monster that lay hidden beneath his charm. It wasn't until that moment, with the magic still swirling in the air, that Kamsi finally understood. With a gasp, Kamsi staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth. "What is this? What are you?" she whispered, her voice shaking. And just like that, the magic had done its work. Chibuza's true form was no longer hidden. The monstrous, shadowy creature beneath his perfect facade was exposed. And for the first time, Kamsi saw the truth. Chibuza's face twisted in a grimace, his eyes narrowing with fury. "You should have stayed out of this, Kelechi," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Now you've made a terrible mistake." Kelechi's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't flinch. She had done it. She had shown Kamsi the truth. The battle had only just begun. The air in the room had grown cold, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Kamsi stood frozen, her face pale, her body trembling. The weight of the moment hung heavily over them. She had seen the truth. She had seen what Chibuza truly was, and now there was no turning back. Kelechi stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Kamsi, watching her friend as she struggled to process the revelation. Her heart ached for Kamsi, knowing how much pain this moment would cause her, but there was no other way. Chibuza had to be stopped, and this was the only path left to them. Chibuza's eyes narrowed with fury. His hands, once held gracefully at his sides, now clenched into fists, his knuckles white. The illusion of his human form flickered, and for a split second, the monstrous shape beneath him was more visible. A swirling vortex of shadow, a dark mass of energy pulsing with ancient malevolence. His true nature was out, and there was no hiding it now. "You think you can stop me?" His voice was a low growl, each word dripping with venom. "You've only made things worse for yourselves." He took a step forward, and the room seemed to shrink in response, as though the very air thickened with his presence. The force of his anger crackled like static electricity. Kamsi took a stumbling step back, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "What are you? What have you done to me?" Her voice broke on the last word, as though she were begging for the answer to something she couldn't bear to hear. Kalichi moved closer to Kamsi, her own heart racing as she stood between her friend and the creature that had once seemed so perfect. She could feel the dark magic that clung to Chibusa like a second skin, and she knew that if she didn't act quickly, the situation would spiral out of control. "Chibusa," Kalechi said, her voice firm but laced with fear, "it's over. Your manipulation ends now." The monster, no, the being that wore Chibusa's face, let out a cruel laugh, sharp and unrelenting. "Over? You think you can stop me with mere words? I've waited too long, girl. You've already played into my hands." His eyes locked onto Kamsi, and the temperature in the room dropped even further. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, like dark tendrils reaching out for them. Kamsi's breathing was ragged, her hands shaking. She glanced between Kalichi and Chibusa, a mix of fear and confusion clouding her eyes. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she whispered to Kalichi, her voice full of hurt. "Why didn't you warn me before I... Kalichi's throat tightened, but she swallowed the lump that had formed there. "I couldn't. You wouldn't have believed me. You were blinded by the idea of what he was, of what you thought you wanted. But this is real, Kamsi. This is the truth." Kamsi's gaze flickered back to Chibusa, and for a moment Kalichi thought she could see something in her friend's eyes, a flicker of recognition. The fear was still there, but there was also a spark of anger, a growing understanding. She wasn't just hurt anymore, she was mad, and that Kalichi realized was the key. "This isn't love, Kamsi," Kalechi continued softly but with urgency. "What he's been doing to you, to all of us, it's manipulation, it's power, and it's never going to stop unless you break free." Kamsi blinked, the words sinking in slowly. She was still shaking, but there was a fire burning in her gaze now. Her eyes, once clouded with doubt and confusion, were beginning to clear. Slowly she nodded, as though awakening from a long, dark sleep. Chibusa sneered at the exchange, and with a sudden, brutal movement, he lunged forward, his arms outstretched as though to grab Kamsi. The air in the room seemed to crackle with power as his monstrous form stretched toward her, a living darkness. But Kalichi was ready. Without a second thought, she reached into her pouch, pulling out a small, glowing stone. It pulsed with light, its glow a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness Chibusa brought with him. She held it up, whispering an incantation under her breath. The stone flared with bright, radiant energy, a beacon of purity in the midst of the shadows. The moment the light touched Chibusa, he recoiled, his monstrous form flickering and writhing as if in pain. A low, guttural howl erupted from him, and the darkness around him seemed to pulse, thrash, and retreat. For the first time, Kalechi saw fear in his eyes. "How you think that trinket can stop me?" he hissed, his voice now a frantic growl. "You know nothing of the power I wield." Kalichi's eyes narrowed as she stepped forward, the stone held high between them. "I don't need to know everything. I just need you to leave. Forever." The stone shone brighter, and with it the very air seemed to tremble. Chibusa let out a roar, a final violent cry as the shadows around him collapsed inward. The darkness that had once seemed so unshakable began to disintegrate, consumed by the light, and then with a final shriek he vanished. The room, once thick with malice, fell eerily still. Kamsi stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief. She didn't move for several moments, as though she were waiting for the darkness to return, to reclaim everything, but nothing happened. Silence lingered, and gradually the tension that had choked the room began to lift. Kalechi lowered the stone, her hands shaking from the sheer force of the magic she had just wielded. The power had been overwhelming, but she had known it was the only way. Finally, Kamsi spoke, her voice a whisper, as though she were still unsure whether any of this had truly happened. "Is he gone? For good?" Kalichi nodded, her eyes never leaving Kamsi's face. "Yes, he's gone, and he's never coming back." Kamsi's face crumpled then, her shoulders shaking as tears spilled down her cheeks. "I didn't know," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I didn't see it. I didn't see how he was using me." Kalichi stepped forward, wrapping her arms around her friend in a tight hug. "It's not your fault, Kamsi. He's a master at what he does, but you're free now, you're safe." The two women stood there, holding each other in the silence that followed, the weight of the past few days finally beginning to settle. The battle was over, but the healing had just begun, and as they pulled away from the embrace, Kalichi knew the fight wasn't truly over. Chibusa might be gone, but there would always be more like him. Forces of darkness, disguised as light, waiting to manipulate and destroy. Kalichi glanced at Kamsi, who was now standing tall, her eyes no longer filled with confusion, but with strength. "You're not alone," Kalichi said softly, a quiet promise in her words. "I'll always be here to protect you." Kamsi nodded, her eyes full of gratitude and newfound resolve. "I know, Kalichi, and I'll be stronger for it." Together, they turned toward the door, knowing that while the darkness had been defeated for now, their journey was far from over. The days that followed Chibusa's defeat felt strange to Kamsi. At first, there was a sense of overwhelming relief, like a heavy weight had been lifted from her chest. But as the days passed, the silence seemed to grow louder, filling her with a discomfort she hadn't expected. She was free now, free from Chibusa, from his manipulation, from the dark magic that had once bound her. But freedom came with its own kind of emptiness, one that she wasn't prepared for. She spent most of her time in Kalichi's small, cozy cottage just outside the village. It was a place of calm, nestled between towering trees that whispered in the wind, offering solace from the chaos of the outside world. But even in the peace of the forest, Kamsi couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Kalichi, ever the watchful protector, noticed the change in her friend. At first, she thought it was just the after-effects of the trauma, but as the days went by, she realized it was more than that. Kamsi wasn't just grieving the loss of Chibusa. She was grieving something deeper, something that had been taken from her long before the dark figure had entered her life. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting a golden hue over the landscape, Kalichi found Kamsi sitting on the porch, her gaze lost in the distance. The light seemed to make her look smaller somehow, as if the weight of her thoughts were physically pulling her down. Kalichi stepped onto the porch and sat down beside her without saying a word. She knew better than to push Kamsi when she wasn't ready to speak. But after a long silence, Kamsi finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think I'll ever be able to forgive myself?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the horizon, but her words clearly directed at Kalichi. Kalichi was taken aback by the question. She had assumed that after everything, after the magic and the confrontation, Kamsi would feel a sense of triumph or at least closure. But the look in Kamsi's eyes told her everything she needed to know. There was no easy answer to that question. "Forgive yourself for what?" Kalichi asked gently, not wanting to assume anything but knowing that Kamsi needed to be asked. Kamsi sighed, her shoulders slumping as she finally turned to look at her friend. "For letting him get so close to me, for ignoring the signs, for trusting him when I should have known better." Kalichi's heart broke for her friend. She could see the pain in Kamsi's eyes, the guilt, the shame, the self-blame. But it wasn't her fault. She had been caught in Chibusa's web, just like so many others before her, and no amount of guilt would change the fact that she had been manipulated. "Listen to me, Kamsi," Kalichi said, her voice firm but full of warmth. "You didn't know, you couldn't have known. Chibusa is a master of deceit. He's been doing this for centuries. He knows how to prey on people's weaknesses and desires. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. But that doesn't make it your fault." Kamsi looked at her friend, her expression a mixture of disbelief and yearning. "But I should have known," she insisted. "There were signs. There were moments when I felt like something wasn't right, but I ignored them. I didn't listen to my instincts." Kalichi sighed, leaning back in her chair as she gazed at the stars beginning to appear in the sky. "It's easy to say that now, but when you're in the thick of it, when you're blinded by love or desire or fear, It's not always so simple. We all make mistakes, Kamsi, but the important thing is what you do after. What you've done after all this. It's more than enough. Kamsi was quiet for a long time, her eyes searching the horizon as though trying to find an answer there. The weight of her emotions hung heavily in the air, but there was something in Kelechi's words that seemed to ease the tension in her chest, even if only slightly. After a long pause, Kamsi finally spoke again, her voice softer, more reflective this time. "Do you think I can rebuild my life? Do you think I can ever trust anyone again?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the implications of what it meant to start over, to heal. Trust wasn't something Kamsi had taken lightly, and now, after everything that had happened, she wasn't sure if it was something she could ever give again. Kelechi leaned forward, her eyes meeting Kamsi's with a knowing look. "I can't promise you it'll be easy. Trust takes time to rebuild, not just with others, but with yourself. But I believe in you, Kamsi. You're stronger than you think." For a long time they sat in silence, watching as the stars began to fill the sky, each one a tiny spark of light in the vast darkness. It was as if the universe itself was offering them a quiet reminder that no matter how dark things got, there was always a way forward. Slowly, the tension that had been wrapped tightly around Kamsi's heart began to loosen. She wasn't healed, not by any means, but for the first time in a long while she felt a flicker of hope. Later that night, as they prepared for bed, Kamsi stood by the window for a moment, gazing out into the night. The world outside was quiet, peaceful, and the moon shone brightly, casting a soft glow over the land. She didn't have all the answers yet, and she didn't know how long it would take to heal. But one thing was certain, she wasn't alone. Kelechi was there, always ready to stand by her side, and that was enough for now. Kamsi turned away from the window, a small smile on her face. "Thank you, Kelechi," she said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. "For everything," Kelechi smiled back, her heart swelling with affection for her friend. "You don't have to thank me," she replied. "I'm just glad you're here, and I'll always be here for you." As the night settled in around them, Kamsi finally felt the weight of her past begin to loosen just a little. It wasn't the end of her journey, but it was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild, to learn, and to trust again. And as she drifted off to sleep that night, Kamsi knew that no matter what came next, she would face it with courage. After all, she had survived the darkest of times, and if she could survive that, then nothing could stop her from moving forward. A week had passed since Kamsi and Kelechi had shared that quiet evening on the porch. The world had begun to feel a little more manageable, like the heaviness that had once clung to Kamsi's heart was slowly lifting, piece by piece. She spent her days helping Kelechi around the cottage, gardening, fixing small things that had broken, or simply sitting together by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. There was a sense of normalcy now, a rhythm to life that Kamsi hadn't experienced in what felt like forever. But despite the calm, there was still a whisper at the back of her mind, a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there like a shadow that lingered just out of sight. Kamsi tried to push it aside, focusing on the present, on the healing she was slowly starting to experience. Yet the thought refused to go away. On one particularly bright morning, Kamsi woke up early, the sun just beginning to stretch its golden fingers across the sky. She was about to go for her usual morning walk when Kelechi caught her at the door. "Where are you off to so early?" Kelechi asked, her voice laced with concern as she put down the basket of fresh herbs she was preparing. To dry, Kamsi smiled softly, though the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just going for a walk. Needed some air, that's all." Kelechi studied her for a moment, her sharp eyes always catching the smallest details. "Are you sure everything's okay? You've been distant lately." Kamsi hesitated. There was no use hiding it anymore. She had been pushing herself to feel okay, to find peace, but something deep inside her refused to let go of the unease. It was like a storm brewing on the horizon, too far away to see clearly but close enough to make her skin prickle with discomfort. "I'm not sure," Kamsi admitted. "I keep thinking about what comes next." I thought I'd feel more free, but I don't. It's like the weight is gone, but the emptiness still lingers. Kelechi nodded, her expression softening. I understand. Healing isn't as simple as just removing the source of the pain. It takes time to find yourself again, Kamsi. But don't let that silence fool you. Just because it's quiet now doesn't mean the storm isn't coming. The words sent a chill through Kamsi, as if Kelechi had read the very thought that had been haunting her. What do you mean? She asked. Though she was almost afraid to hear the answer, Kelechi's eyes darkened slightly. Chabusa might be gone, but the influence of his magic doesn't just disappear. It lingers like a poison in the air, and there are forces far darker than him that still exist in this world. You've only seen the tip of the iceberg, Umsai. Felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The thought of more dangers, more forces beyond her understanding, was enough to make her want to turn and run. But something inside her, something she didn't quite understand yet, refused to let her walk away. She had been through too much to turn back now. You think there's more to this? Kamsi asked, her voice quiet but steady, as she searched Kelechi's face for some sign of reassurance. Kelechi didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked over to the window, staring out at the landscape beyond, as if she was seeing something Kamsi couldn't. After a long pause, she turned back, her face serious. I'm afraid so, she said. There are always those who seek to control others, to manipulate and twist the world to their will. Chabusa was just one face of that darkness. But there are others out there, ones who can be just as dangerous, if not more so. Kamsi swallowed hard. It was a lot to process, more than she had ever imagined. She thought that defeating Chabusa would have brought an end to it all, that she could finally breathe easy again. But now the horizon seemed darker than ever, and the questions that had once seemed distant were now very much real. Do you think they'll come after me? Kamsi asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her attempt to keep it steady. Kelechi gave her a reassuring look, though the concern in her eyes was unmistakable. I can't say for sure, but I will tell you this. Nothing that has happened to you so far was by chance. You have something that others want, something powerful. And whether you realize it or not, you're still a part of something much larger than yourself. Kamsi felt a shiver run down her spine at Kelechi's words. What do you mean? What do I have that's so special? Kelechi's expression softened, though there was an edge of sadness there. I wish I could explain it all to you, Kamsi, but it's not something that can be explained easily. Some things you have to experience for yourself. Before Kamsi could ask any more questions, Kelechi stood up abruptly and walked toward the back of the cottage. Stay here for a moment, I'll be right back. Kamsi watched her friend disappear into the small garden behind the cottage, feeling more confused and unsettled than ever. What was it that Kelechi wasn't saying? And why did it feel like the storm she had feared was already beginning to gather as she waited? The air around her seemed to thicken, the quiet too heavy, like something was stirring just beneath the surface. And then, just as Kelechi re-entered the room, there was a sudden, sharp noise, a crack like thunder, though the skies outside were clear. Kamsi froze, her heart pounding. It wasn't the sound of a storm. It was something else, something far more ominous. Kelechi's face went pale. It's started, she whispered. We need to prepare. The peaceful world that Kamsi had begun to rebuild in the aftermath of her pain was about to shatter once again. And this time she wasn't sure if she was ready for the storm that was coming. The air was thick with a tension Kamsi could almost taste. The sudden noise, the crack like thunder but without a storm in sight, had sent her heart racing. She stood frozen, staring at Kelechi, trying to understand what had just happened. For a moment, the world felt like it had tilted sideways, leaving her disoriented and afraid. Kelechi's eyes darted to the window, scanning the horizon as if searching for something unseen. There was an urgency in her movements that Kamsi had never seen before, her normally calm demeanor replaced by a sharpness that set Kamsi on edge. What was that noise? Kamsi asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay composed. Kelechi didn't immediately respond. Instead, she turned toward the back door, pushing it open and stepping into the garden with a sense of purpose. Kamsi followed, her feet heavy with uncertainty. Something had changed. The quiet peace they had shared over the past week had been shattered, and she had no idea what to do next. Outside, the air was still, unnervingly still. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the earth, but the peaceful serenity of the afternoon had vanished. Every rustling leaf, every distant bird call seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. It was as though the storm that had been building within Kamsi's mind had come to life in the atmosphere around her. As the day wore on and the light began to fade, the sense of impending doom seemed to grow. But Kamsi didn't flinch. She stood tall, her eyes fixed on the future. She would face this storm head-on. The moon hung high in the sky, a cold, indifferent sentinel watching over the quiet town. Inside the small cottage, Kamsi could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. She had spent the past few days in a daze, grappling with the knowledge of her own power, the power that had drawn Jabusa to her, and as Kelechi had warned was now sought by far darker forces. The threat outside their door had only grown more real, more pressing. The storm that loomed over her life was no longer a distant thing. It was here, and it was coming fast. Kelechi had been tirelessly researching the ancient texts she had kept, hidden for years, scouring them for any clue about the force that was after Kamsi, but every answer seemed to raise more questions. The magic that sought her, the legacy buried deep within her bloodline, was as old as the earth itself, and as dangerous as any curse. Tonight, everything had changed. Kelechi had been pacing back and forth, muttering under her breath as she skimmed through the fragile pages of an old scroll. Her eyes were sharp, and there was a sense of urgency in her every movement. Kamsi had been watching her from the corner of the room, her mind racing. What if she wasn't ready for whatever was coming? What if she couldn't harness the power that everyone kept talking about? What if she failed? Kelechi's voice broke through her thoughts. "Kamsi," she said, her tone steady, but filled with the kind of grim resolve that Kamsi hadn't heard before. "I've found something, a ritual, something that can help us." Kamsi looked up, her heart skipping a beat. "A ritual? What kind of ritual?" Her voice was shaky, but she couldn't help the surge of hope that flared within her. Kelechi nodded, her eyes narrowing as she closed the scroll. "It's an ancient protective spell, one that can shield you from the magic that is being used." "Against you. But there's a catch." Kamsi's stomach dropped. She hated the sound of that word. "What's the catch?" Kelechi's face was serious now, her lips pressing into a tight line. "The ritual requires a sacrifice, a personal one, something that will bind you to the magic for the rest of your life. It's not something you can walk away from once it's done." Kamsi swallowed hard. A sacrifice? She could feel the unease settling deep in her bones. She had already lost so much. Her life had been torn apart by Jabusa's manipulation. She had no family left, no home. What else could she possibly give up? Kelechi stepped closer to her, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "I wouldn't ask this of you if I didn't think it was the only way. But I need you to understand what this means. Once you perform this ritual, you will become bound to the very forces that seek to control you, and you won't be able to break free from it." The weight of Kelechi's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, threatening to burst. Kamsi could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the enormity of what was being asked of her weighing heavily on her mind. Could she really go through with this? Was she willing to sacrifice everything for the chance to finally be free? As the silence stretched between them, Kamsi thought back to all that had happened, the manipulation, the lies, the control. She thought about Jabusa and the hold he had almost claimed over her, how she had almost lost herself completely to his power. And then she thought about her future, about the possibility of truly breaking free from all of it. "I don't have a choice, do I?" Kamsi whispered, the words escaping her lips before she could stop them. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest, and she could feel the air leave her lungs as she processed the truth of her situation. Kelechi's eyes softened with understanding. "No, you don't. But you are not alone in this, Kamsi. I will be here, every step of the way. You have my word." Kamsi nodded, trying to steady her breath, to find the strength to face what was ahead. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but she knew that this was her chance, the only chance she would ever have to truly be free. Kalichi moved to the center of the room, lighting a circle of candles with steady hands. The warm flicker of the flames filled the room with an eerie light, casting long shadows on the walls. Kamsi could feel the atmosphere shift, the air thickening as if the ritual had already begun in some unseen way. "Stand in the circle," Kalechi instructed, her voice calm but firm. Kamsi hesitated for just a moment before stepping into the center, her heart racing with uncertainty. Kalechi raised her hands, murmuring words that Kamsi couldn't understand. The air seemed to hum with energy, and Kamsi felt a strange pull in her chest, as if something deep inside her was awakening. Her breath caught in her throat, and her skin tingled with an unfamiliar heat. The candles flickered more violently now, their flames rising higher, casting odd shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Kamsi's mind began to whirl, her thoughts growing frantic, as the realization of what she was about to do hit her with full force. "Remember," Kalichi's voice broke through the growing chaos. "This is your decision, but once the ritual begins, there will be no turning back." Kamsi took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her choice settle over her like a cloak. Her hands clenched into fists, the sense of determination rising in her chest. She had already lost so much. She wasn't about to let fear take this from her, too. With a final steadying breath, Kamsi nodded. "I'm ready." Kalichi gave a small, approving nod, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sadness. Then, with a swift motion, she thrust her hands toward the circle, and the air crackled with power. The room was bathed in a golden light, and Kamsi felt her body tremble as something deep inside her, something ancient, responded to the call. The ritual had begun. As the light intensified, Kamsi could feel the magic wrap around her, a force both gentle and consuming. She closed her eyes, trying to center herself in the midst of the storm, but the sensation was overwhelming. The power inside her surged, and for the briefest of moments, she could hear whispers, voices in a language she couldn't understand, voices that seemed to reach deep into her soul, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. Kamsi opened her eyes, gasping for breath. The room was still. The candles flickered faintly. She felt different, not in a way she could explain, but there was a power in her now, a force that had become a part of her. The ritual was complete. Kalechi stepped forward, her eyes searching Kamsi's face. "It's done," she said softly. "The bond is made, but you must be careful now. The forces that sought you will not stop. They will come for you again." Kamsi nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the magic within her. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let anyone control her again. The storm was still out there, but now she had the strength to face it.